Welcome to this presentation. In this presentation, we will be discussing an overview of student growth measures that can be used in relation to the Teacher Incentive Allotment. There are several types of student growth measures we will be discussing today. First are assessments. These can be state-approved or nationally normed or criteria reference tests used with value-added measures, such as VAM. Two, pre and post tests. This can also be a state-approved, nationally normed, or district-created test. However, instead of being used with VAM, it will be used as a pre-test and post-test model. Third are student learning objectives. It's another option for a student growth measure, also known as SLOs. Fourth are portfolios. And finally, there's an other category. For example, the STAR Student Progress Measure, or NWEA MAP growth goals. The first one we will discuss will be value-added measures. Value-added measures, or VAM, measure how much progress students make from year to year. It analyzes students' current and prior assessment data on a nationally normed or criteria reference test, such as STAR or MAP. It looks at a student's prior testing history together with data from students with similar testing histories to create a predicted or expected score for each student. Then a comparison of the predicted scores to the actual scores can determine if more, less, or expected amount of growth occurred. There are three essential factors in VAM, or value-added measures. The first is stretch. The scale of the test must be wide enough to measure growth at both the highest and lowest achieving levels. The second is relevance. The test must also align to state standards such that the test actually measures what students are expected to know and do. And finally, reliability. Scales must be reliable from year to year so that tests can be correlated across the years to determine a predictive relationship. We're going to take a moment to discuss growth versus achievement. It's important to discuss the difference. You can see that in one case we have, at the beginning of the school year, a group of students who start the school year above the proficient line near the advanced level. And yet at the end of the school year, while they still met their achievement goal above that proficient line, the change over time means that this group of students actually did not demonstrate growth over the course of the school year. In fact, while maintaining proficiency, they actually lost some ground. You can see another group of students here at the bottom of the screen. At the start of the school year, they started below the proficient line near the not proficient category. However, over time, by the end of the year, while scoring just below proficient, you can see that this group of students showed significant growth over the course of the year. So while their achievement level would not be proficient, they showed significant growth over the course of the school year. If we compare the two, you can see that the group of students at the top of the screen did not show growth over the course of the school year, while the group of students at the bottom of the screen did show growth over the course of the school year. So this is one of the main ways to highlight the difference between growth versus achievement. Measuring student growth accurately is not easy. There are many factors that can affect measuring student growth, such as measurement error, mobility of students, and missing data. In any given year, there will always be some students who don't test or missing data for a particular student for 1 year or another. However, currently we have an entire year of missing data, so obviously that complicates matters considerably. However, VAM addresses the 3 M's. Measurement error is addressed because it minimizes the effect of measurement error associated with any one test score, since VAM uses historical testing data across multiple years and multiple subjects, which therefore minimizes the effect of an error associated with any one exam. Second, it accounts for the mobility of students by comparing students with similar testing history as opposed to students from a particular school or one particular location. And finally, it compensates for missing data because there's a large sample size across multiple years. So if 1 year is missing, there's still enough data to compensate for that missing year. This is all done through research-based statistical modeling. I want to take a moment to talk about how this is done exactly. Let's take student 1. She has a particular testing history. Specifically, we're going to take into consideration her reading and math scores from 3rd through 8th grade, her science scores from 5th and 8th grade, her social studies test score from 8th grade, her Algebra 1, English 1 and 2, and biology scores. In this example, we're using the STAR test. So if she has a testing history including scores and data across all of those exams for all of those years. Then we're going to look at students who have similar testing histories. When we look at all those exams, there's a pattern of students around the state who happen to have a similar testing history to student 1. Then we give the current exam, the current year's STAR in this example. And we see how did all of the students who were just like student 1 in terms of their testing history, how did they all perform on average on the current exam? That will yield an expected score. We would expect that if the average of all the students who have similar testing history to student 1 had a certain predicted score, that would be the expected score for student 1. How do we use this then to measure growth? Well, you take a student's predicted score or expected score, and you combine it with all of the other students in the similar testing history group, and you end up with a mean or an average predicted score. This will be the expected score that students would get on this exam for this year. Then you take their actual score. How do they actually do on the real test? All of the students, their actual score on the test will give you an average score for their actual test score. And then it's a question of comparing their expected score to their actual score to see if they met their expected growth or not. Entering achievement and expected growth are two very important concepts. Texas statewide VAM model uses all prior testing data to get an idea of students entering achievement and how that compares to how all students did across the state. This then can yield an expectation for each individual student, which is defined by how students just like them academically did on average across the state. In other words, it's a way to do a predicted or expected score. Regardless of entering achievement levels, students should achieve the same level as did other students who are academically just like them across the state. In a nutshell, VAM, the general idea about VAM is that whether a student performed at, above, or below their expected score is a function of the effectiveness of the teacher. And measuring teacher effectiveness is what TIA is all about. The details of the process of how this is done involve complicated statistical analysis, generally done by outside service providers, although some districts have statisticians on staff who also can do this work. Typically across the state, people who are using VAM do contract out with a company to run these mathematical models. Here's a scenario. Crepe Myrtle ISD is a Cohort C district applying for TIA. They use the STAR student progress measure as the student growth measure for all eligible teachers in the district. They consider this to be equivalent to VAM. They checked VAM on their TIA application. Take a moment and press pause on this video and think about what are areas of misunderstanding for Crepe Myrtle ISD and how would you advise them to adjust their application. I would encourage you to press pause, think of your answers to these questions, and when you're ready, press resume play and we'll go over what the answers are. Okay, so with Crepe Myrtle ISD, there's a couple of issues. One, while VAM can be used with STAR, the STAR progress measure itself is not VAM. For Crepe Myrtle ISD, essentially STAR is functioning as a valid pre-test and post-test and does not qualify as VAM. Advice, they could consider running VAM or contracting out to have it done. Or they could change their application to reflect other student growth measure. The STAR student progress measure is a growth measure, but it's not value-added measure specifically. It doesn't match up mathematically to the same processes. It's what we would call an other student growth measure. So if they wanted to keep using that one and not do VAM, they could just change their application to reflect that they're using an other student growth measure, which in this case would be the STAR progress measure. Finally, consider adding a second student growth measure in addition to the STAR student progress measure to increase validity and reliability. We're going to move on now to pre and post tests. Considerations for pre and post tests if you're using them for the TIA. First, the content covered. Is the test a valid measure of course content? Second, administration protocols. Third, scoring protocols. These are all areas that need to be considered when districts are developing their own pre and post test. Let's take them one at a time. Validity, selecting the appropriate assessment. So districts have the choice of selecting a third-party assessment or creating their own assessment. Either one can work as long as it follows these guidelines. First, does the assessment follow state and district guidelines? Is it aligned to state and or national standards for the course? And this includes all standards for the course, including industry standards for CTE courses, world language standards, ACTFL, for example, any kind of national or state standards. Does the assessment align to those standards? Does the assessment measure what it is designed to measure? Do the questions on the test represent an appropriate level of rigor for the course? For example, does it include higher level thinking skills in some of the questions? And finally, does the assessment have enough range that both high and low achieving students can demonstrate growth? In terms of reliability, this is around the test administration protocols. Does the assessment follow state and district guidelines for test administration? Is there a testing window? What kind of test security is in place? What kind of training is provided for teachers and or test proctors? And finally, do teachers administer the tests for their own students, or is there a blind system? Next, we move to scoring of the tests. Who scores the tests? Is there a scoring rubric for tests that require free responses? Who developed the scoring rubric? Is there a district-wide system for scoring so teachers are supported? And is the scoring blind? In some cases, for third-party tests, the third-party test company, such as Iowa Test or NWEA MAP Test, they score the tests themselves and the district doesn't score their own. In other cases, districts use their own pre and post tests, and then they need to think about these things in terms of how they're going to be scoring, who is going to be scoring them, etc. There are also some recommendations from the National Center for Improving Educational Assessment, NCIEA. And essentially, they're the same kinds of things we've been talking about in terms of alignment. Is the test aligned to the big ideas and standards for the course? Are those reflected in the assessment? Does it engage students in appropriate depth of knowledge and difficulty, considering the expected knowledge and skills for the course? And are those reflected on the assessment? In terms of scoring, is it reliable? Are there clear guidelines and criteria across performance levels that are aligned to the standards? And does it allow for different scorers to reach the same score? In other words, if you had two different people score the same test, would they get the same result? That's about being reliable. And it should be a fair and unbiased test, which means, for example, providing opportunity and access for all students, free from unnecessary distractions or information on the assessment, and clear identifiable prompts or questions so that we can make sure that students are answering the questions with as much clarity as possible. So these are more recommendations on designing an assessment if you want to design your own pre-post test for TIA. Here's a scenario. Oleander ISD is a Cohort A district applying for TIA. They use the MAP growth interim assessments as the student growth measure for all kindergarten through second grade teachers. This test is given at the beginning of the year, so Oleander uses this as a pre-test post-test. Teachers give the test to their own students at any point during the first 3 months of school and the last 2 months of school. All tests are scored by MAP. So again, I want you to think about these questions. If you would take a moment and pause this video and think about how does Oleander ISD's use of the MAP align with TIA requirements that we just went over for use of pre and post tests, and what kind of advice would you give them to adjust their plan? So take a moment, pause, think about your answers to these questions, and whenever you're ready, resume play, and we'll get to some discussion on the next slide. Oleander ISD, in terms of alignment, MAP is a nationally normed commissioner-approved test, so they're aligned there. It's given 2 different times of the year as a pre-test, post-test, so good for Oleander. And the NWA map scores the test and sends the results back to the district, so the district themselves don't score the test. So they're aligned there. Advice: consider instituting a testing window. Remember, they said the teacher gave the test whenever they wanted to during a 3-month period. That's not really a testing window. They also might need to think about greater testing security measures to increase the validity of the test. And another piece of advice would be consider training several teachers as testing proctors so the teachers don't always test their own students. Another piece of reliability is that you can have different people giving tests to students instead of their own teacher in case there might be any cause for bias in the system. That's something that Oleander might want to consider. We're going to move on now to student learning objectives. The current framing of SLOs is really designed to be a teacher-directed tool to support teacher growth. The SLO rating rubric mostly is about procedural compliance, not necessarily results. For example, did the teacher complete the steps? Whereas for SLOs, what we really want, for TIA, we want SLOs to be mostly about demonstrating student growth as a student growth measure. It's also still a great professional development tool for teachers, but we're going to shift the focus to really be emphasizing more student growth. Currently, the SLO rating rubric, if in the proficient category, it says all or most of the following have been accomplished. Teacher has crafted a quality SLO, teacher has set student growth goals, teacher has monitored student progress, and way at the bottom, it's most students demonstrated targeted growth. So if the district wants to If a district is choosing to use SLOs as a valid and reliable student growth measure for purposes of a teacher incentive allotment, it's recommended that the districts use the original guidance as a baseline of their SLO program, consult the TIA tips that have been added to the current guidance, and note that there'll be updated SLO training coming soon in early spring. The guidance for the SLO process is found at texasslo.org. This includes resources for teachers, administrators, detailed information, as well as at-a-glance resources, and does include the brand new TIA tips for SLO. There are 3 phases of the SLO process. The first one is around creating an SLO. The idea here is to emphasize priority of content. It needs to be aligned to the standards for the course and represent a foundational skill of the course. In addition, the SLO should have a clear rationale as to why that particular content was selected. And of course, it's important to emphasize the need for the SLO to be about a representative group of a teacher's students. During phase 1, the teacher sets learning targets for each of the students in the SLO group. This centers around the idea of preparedness levels, and there need to be multiple sources of data in order to determine a student's preparedness level to learn the content of the course. These data sources can include prior grades and testing data, current grades and student work from the first 4 to 6 weeks of the school year, prior and current attendance, current observed classroom behaviors. Using these factors, the teacher will determine the student's skill level at the beginning of the year in what's called an initial skill profile. Details for how to create an initial skill profile can be found at texasslo.org. Also during this phase, the teacher creates a rubric for what does end of the year mastery level look like across a variety of skill levels. Again, detailed information for how to create a targeted skill profile can be found at texasslo.org. Here is a scenario for Begonia ISD during phase 1 of their SLO process. Begonia ISD is a Cohort D district applying for TIA. They use SLOs as the student growth measure for all eligible teachers. Teachers select their own SLO focus and are not required to align their SLO with standards, have their SLO approved, or provide a rationale for their chosen content. Teachers use a representative group of students for their SLO group. Teachers are not required to determine preparedness levels for their students or review any current or historical student data prior to creating the initial skill profile or the targeted skill profile. Take a moment, please, and pause this video and jot down your answers to this question. How does Begonia ISD's Phase 1 SLO process align with TIA? What issues do you see in their SLO system? And finally, what advice would you give them to adjust their plan? Take a few moments to press pause, write down your answers, and restart the video when you are ready to resume. For Begonia ISD, their Phase 1 SLO process does demonstrate the best practice, at least one, and that is that they are using a representative group of students for their SLO. Some issues they have with their Phase 1 is that their SLOs are not aligned to major content standards for the course. Teachers are not required to give a rationale for why they chose the content and the focus area that they chose for their SLO, and they also do not use multiple data sources to determine preparedness levels of students. Advice for Begonia might be require that all SLOs must be tied to a foundational skill for the course, require that appraisers approve the SLO, and set preparedness levels based on historical and current student work. Now we'll move on to Phase 2 of the SLO process. Phase 2 is monitoring student progress. There is a need to emphasize a robust body of evidence of student work. At the end of the year, this body of evidence will be used to determine student growth. It's important in Phase 2 to define what counts as a quality task, assessment, or project in order to be considered to be part of the body of evidence. There also should be a minimum number of data points to be included in the body of evidence. For example, 5 pieces of student work or evidence per student, and requiring body of evidence check-ins at least quarterly with a teacher and appraiser is a best practice. In building the body of evidence, it's important to consider what important content aligned to the SLO does the assignment or test or project assess. Also important to know with clarity what foundational skill does the assignment, test, or project assess, and how many pieces of student work are required to have a valid body of evidence. Here's another scenario for Begonia ISD on Phase 2 of their SLO process. Begonia ISD teachers give a teacher-created pretest in the beginning of the year. They then give the same test as a post-test at the end of the year. This is the only evidence they provide for their SLO. There are no requirements for a body of evidence, and no one approves the pretest post-test. Teacher appraisers in BISD check in with teachers on their SLO only at the end of the year. Take a moment to jot down your answers to this question. How does Begonia ISD's Phase 2 SLO process align with TIA? What issues do you see in their SLO system? And what advice would you give them to adjust their plan? Take a moment to pause the video and jot down your answers to these questions. When you're ready, resume the video. Begonia ISD does not exhibit any best practices in their Phase 2. Some of the issues are that they do not require a body of evidence. There's a teacher-created test, but there are no protocols to ensure the validity of that test. Appraisers do not check in with teachers on their SLO throughout the year. Advice would be require a body of evidence, not just 2 tests. If tests are a part of the body of evidence, which they can be, ensure that the tests align with the SLO, and require appraisers to check in with teachers on their SLO quarterly. Now we'll move to Phase 3, the final phase of the SLO process, and that is evaluating student progress. There's a need to emphasize how important it is to use the rubric that was created back in Step 1, that targeted skill profile, to assess student work. You need to emphasize that grounding end-of-year mastery levels in the body of evidence for each student is really important, and it has to be decided upon as it aligns to the rubric. Emphasizing the need to determine growth for each student based on the body of evidence. Emphasize the need for appraiser to review the body of evidence and approve. This is critical if you're going to have a working SLO process. There needs to be checks and balances so that both the teacher and appraiser work collaboratively to approve the body of evidence and ensure that it does in fact demonstrate student growth based on student work. Here's a scenario for Phase 3 Begonia ISD. Teachers grade the post-tests of their own students. Some teachers have students grade each other's tests. There is no body of evidence, just the pre-test score and the post-test score. The tests are given at any time at the teacher's discretion. Teachers do not align students' end-of-year performance to the targeted skill profile. Appraisers include a short debrief of the SLO process during the teacher end-of-year conferences. Take a moment to answer these questions. How does Begonia ISD's Phase 3 SLO process align with TIA? What issues do you see in their SLO system? And what advice would you give Begonia ISD to adjust their plans for Phase 3? Take a moment to jot down your answers to these questions and press resume when you're finished. Begonia ISD exhibits the best practice of including SLOs at the end of year conference. Some issues with their Phase 3 include using a teacher-created test that doesn't appear to have been approved by anyone. It's not clear if it's aligned to the standards. It's not clear that the test even measures what the SLO is about. There don't appear to be any testing protocols or security with the test, and the scoring is not reliable since teacher grades her own students' tests and even lets student grades each other tests, which is a little bit sketchy. Advice would be require the appraiser to review and approve student growth determinations based on a body of evidence and decide whether they want a pre-test, post-test system or an SLO system. In Begonia's case, it may be that they prefer having a valid pre-test and post-test and they don't actually want to do a body of evidence-based SLO process, which is a choice they can make. Or if they choose to do the SLO process, they need to make sure they're aligning to the Texas SLO processes for all 3 phases. Questions to consider as we review the 3 phases of SLO. Phase 1 is create an SLO. Phase 2 is to monitor progress. Phase 3 is to evaluate success and determine student growth. Very important in Phase 1 to focus on what information is being used to inform the creation of the SLO, to what related standards is it aligned, and is all available data being considered when growth targets are set. For Phase 2, the focus is on are the assessments, tasks, projects being assigned to students one that align to the SLO such that they could become part of the body of evidence. And in Phase 3, it's using that body of evidence against the targeted skill profile to determine student growth. We will now move on to portfolios. Portfolios are another option for a student growth measure for the purposes of the Teacher Incentive Allotment. They work especially well with performance-based courses, although they can be used for any course. Student work products can be very varied using a portfolio system. For example, audio or video recordings of student musical, choir, or theatrical performances, student artwork, either scanned digitally or hard copy, or both, or sample student-created products such as welding work, woodwork, metalwork, etc. Student work is then assessed against a skill proficiency rubric. So using portfolios with expected growth has to do with progression along a skill rubric. Unlike VAM, pre-test, post-tests, SLOs, portfolios measure students' movement along a skill progression. You look at the student's skill level at the beginning of the year based on the skill progression rubric, and the student's skill level at the end of the year based on the skill progression rubric, and use an assessment of student work products grounded in the specific skill details of the rubric to determine growth. A word on portfolios. Sometimes portfolios can mean a lot of different things and is used by different people to mean different things. One example is a working portfolio. This mostly contains works in progress. There's also a display or showcase portfolio, which is designed to show a student's best work. And then there's an assessment portfolio, which is the one we're going to be focusing on if you're using portfolios as a student growth measure for the Teacher Incentive Allotment. And this has to do with student work that shows student levels of mastery of curriculum or skill proficiency based on the student work. We're going to give you an example of some best practices here. So assessments, projects, and work products designed to go in the portfolio need to be, first of all, aligned to the content standards of the course. Second, specify what skill proficiencies are required across a variety of proficiency levels. Specify what the students have to be able to demonstrate, and include a rubric that describes what various levels of proficiency look like for all aspects of the task. We'll use middle school choir as an example. Here's an example of a skill proficiency rubric for a middle school choir. In this example, middle school choir has 3 main content areas that are the focus of the course: posture, sight reading, and rhythm. So this teacher wrote out a rubric for what significantly limited proficiency, somewhat proficient, proficient, and advanced looks like with respect to these three key behaviors: posture, sight reading, and rhythm. Let's take sight reading as an example. A student at the beginning of the year with significantly limited proficiency is a student who's unfamiliar with reading music and cannot recognize notes, all the way over to advanced, where a student can sight read a musical piece with accuracy and transcribe notes. This is a skill progression from very limited skill proficiency all the way to advanced skill proficiency with respect to sight reading. Notice how these descriptors are specific and describe what a student knows or is able to do with respect to, in this case, choir. This teacher then will assess all of her students at the beginning of the year via a performance of them. In this case, the performance of the choir class, the teacher would grade the students based on this rubric with their ability to do these things. Unable to remain in singing posture, moves around frequently. Somewhat proficient would be beginning with singing posture, but struggling to remain, all the way to advanced, student sustains posture almost all of the time. Based on the student's performance, these students are assessed with this skill proficiency rubric and assigned their proficiency for the beginning of the year. Then at the end of the year, a different performance is recorded, and the teacher assesses the students along this same rubric to see what is their proficiency in their end of year performance. In this example, this teacher previously had students in these different categories. At the end of the year, she has 0 students with significantly limited proficiency. She had 5 students with limited. She had 5 students proficient. She had 5 students somewhat proficient, and she had 5 students advanced. These are where her students ended up at the end of the year. So she then can use this chart as an example for measuring growth. Along the y-axis is where they were at the beginning of the year based on their skill level using the rubric. And along the x-axis is where they were at the end of the year based on their skill level using the rubric. You can see that a student who started the year at somewhat proficient and ended the year still at somewhat proficient did not meet growth goals, whereas a student who started somewhat proficient and ended the year proficient would have met expected growth, and if that student ended the year aligned to the advanced category of the rubric, that student would have exceeded expected growth. All of this has to do with the student's skill proficiency tied to the rubric, comparing their beginning of the year level to their end of year level to determine expected growth. A little to-do list for assessment portfolios. 1, determine the curricular standards or skills to be addressed. In the middle school choir example, that teacher chose posture, sight reading, and rhythm. It could be whatever the most important curricular standards or skills for the course in question. 2, design student tasks, assessments, projects that represent the content and skill levels that will be needed in order to demonstrate mastery. 3, design performance standards and describe in detail what various levels of mastery look like. In our middle school choir example, there was a detailed descriptor for each performance level across each of the key areas that were the important skills for that course. This is critical if you're going to use the rubric to determine student growth. And finally, training a team of teachers or other professionals to evaluate portfolios using the rubric. This will increase the reliability of the scoring, so it's not always the teacher scoring her own students. There are other people who would get at that same score using that same rubric. Finally, there are other student growth measures that can be used. So far, we've covered pre-test and post-test, value-added measures, SLOs, and portfolios. There are also other student growth measures. For example, the STAR Student Progress Measure is available for districts who want to use that as a growth measure. Districts that are using NWE MAP tests, those tests also come with growth goals, and other growth goals can come from other related criteria referenced or nationally normed tests. A quick word about STAR test. STAR can be used in a variety of ways. It can be used as a pre-test, post-test. It can be used as the basis for calculating VAM, or it can be used as a predicted growth measure using the STAR Student Progress Measure for applicable courses. And a quick note on that, there are many STAR tests. Some of them have STAR, most of them have STAR Student Progress Measures, but some do not. On this list, anything that is highlighted in yellow does not have a student progress measure. However, there is a STAR test for that course. For example, in 4th grade writing, there's a STAR test, but there is no STAR student progress measure. Or in English 1, there is a STAR test, but there is no STAR progress measure. Thank you so much for your attention and your time. If you have any questions about using student growth measures for the Teacher Incentive Allotment, please do not hesitate to contact us at TIA@tea.texas.gov. Thank you very much.